In the bitter winter of 1842, beneath the frost-covered stones of Château de Maléfique in the Loire Valley, servants whispered of crimson stains that never dried. They spoke in hushed voices of their mistress, Countess Isabelle de Montclair, who had not aged a single day in 20 years, while her staff grew pale and weak, one by one disappearing into the night. The local physician, Dr. Henri Beaumont, would later write in his private journal that what he discovered in the chateau's hidden chambers defied every law of God and nature. Blood, he wrote, so much blood that it had seeped into the very foundations of the castle, creating a burgundy map of horror that stretched through secret corridors like veins in a corpse. But this was no ordinary murder, no crime of passion or madness. This was something far more calculated, far more ancient, and far more terrifying than the simple minds of 1842 could comprehend. The Countess had discovered something that the elite have always known but never spoken aloud. That power flows not from gold or land, but from the life force of those deemed expendable. What happened in that chateau would be buried by authorities, hidden from history books, and erased from official records. But the truth, like blood, has a way of seeping through the cracks of time. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. The France of 1842 was a nation caught between revolution and restoration, where the old aristocracy clung desperately to their crumbling power, while the common people grew restless in their hovels. In the Loire Valley, ancient chateaux stood like monuments to a dying world, their Gothic spires piercing the grey winter sky like accusations against heaven. The Château de Maléfique had been in the Montclair family for 7 centuries, its stones soaked with the blood of peasant uprisings, religious wars, and the countless small cruelties that defined noble privilege. The village of Saint-Damien, nestled in the chateau's shadow, was home to barely 300 souls, farmers, servants, and craftsmen who had served the Montclair family for generations. They lived in thatched cottages that leaked in winter and sweltered in summer, existing on thin soup and darker bread while their betters dined on venison and wine. But even in their poverty, they noticed things. Marie Dubois, the baker's wife, would later testify that no servant who entered the chateau's employ ever seemed to return to the village. They didn't quit. They didn't run away to Paris. They simply vanished, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. The villagers learned not to ask questions, not to look too closely at the pale faces that occasionally appeared at the chateau's windows, not to wonder why the Countess never seemed to age while everyone around her withered like autumn leaves. Fear, you see, is the oldest form of social control, and if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Isabelle de Montclair was born into a world of absolute privilege in the final days of the Ancien Régime, when nobles believed their blood carried divine essence that separated them from the common rabble. Her father, Count Alexandre, had been a confidant of Marie Antoinette, a man who collected forbidden books on alchemy, demonology, and what the church called the darkest of arts. The family library contained texts that predated Christianity, manuscripts written in languages that scholars feared to translate, and diagrams of rituals that promised immortality to those bold enough to pay the required price. Isabelle was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were sharp, aristocratic, carved from marble rather than flesh. But her eyes held a depth that seemed to contain centuries, and those who looked into them too long reported feeling as though their very souls were being weighed and measured. She married young to a distant cousin who died mysteriously within a year, leaving her sole mistress of the vast Montclair estates. The local priest, Father Mathieu, noted in his records that she never attended confession, never took communion, and seemed to regard the crucifix above the altar with something approaching amusement. She surrounded herself with servants chosen not for their skills, but for their youth, their health, their vitality. They were always beautiful, these servants, men and women in the prime of life, who radiated the energy that only the young possess. But beauty, as the Countess had learned from her father's forbidden texts, was merely the vessel. What mattered was what flowed beneath the skin, what carried life itself through mortal veins. The ancients knew this secret, and now, in her isolated chateau, Isabelle would rediscover it. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong came in the autumn of 1841, when young Thomas Moreau, the blacksmith's son, took a position as the chateau's groundskeeper. He was 19 years old, strong as an ox, with the kind of robust health that comes from years of honest labor. His mother, Marguerite, expected him to visit every Sunday after Mass, as he always had. But the Sundays came and went, and Thomas never appeared. When Marguerite finally worked up the courage to approach the chateau, the gatekeeper, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, told her that Thomas had been sent away on urgent business for the Countess. Weeks passed. Other families began to tell similar stories. Claire Rousseau, the carpenter's daughter, had gone to work in the chateau's kitchens and vanished without a word. Pierre Lefebvre, a strapping farm boy hired to tend the stables, simply never came home one evening. The pattern was always the same. Young, healthy servants would enter the chateau's service, and within weeks or months, they would disappear entirely. No letters, no messages, no explanations. The village doctor, Dr. Beaumont, began to notice something else that chilled his blood. Those servants who did occasionally return to the village, usually after only a few days of employment, looked fundamentally different. They were pale, weak, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls, as though some vital essence had been drained from their bodies. They spoke little and avoided eye contact, but when pressed about their experiences at the chateau, they would only whisper about strange ceremonies, about rooms beneath the main house that no servant was supposed to enter, about the sound of chanting that echoed through the corridors late at night. Dr. Henri Beaumont was not a man easily frightened. He had served as a field surgeon during the Napoleonic Wars, had seen battlefields carpeted with corpses, had performed amputations by candlelight while cannons roared overhead, but the condition of the servants returning from Château de Maléfique disturbed him in ways that warfare never had. They displayed symptoms that had no medical explanation: severe anemia without apparent blood loss, premature aging that seemed to accelerate week by week, and a curious psychological condition that he could only describe as spiritual exhaustion. Their hearts beat weakly, their skin took on a translucent quality, and most disturbing of all, they seemed to have lost some essential spark of humanity. When Beaumont examined them, he found puncture wounds on their necks, arms and wrists. Small, precise incisions that had healed but left distinctive scars. The wounds were too clean to be accidental, too symmetrical to be the result of violence, and far too numerous to be explained by any conventional medical procedure. He began keeping detailed records, sketching the scar patterns, documenting the progression of symptoms, trying to find some rational explanation for what he was witnessing. But rationality, he would soon discover, had no place in the dark reality of what the Countess had unleashed. The breakthrough came when young Marie Blanchard, a servant who had worked in the chateau for only 3 days before fleeing in terror, agreed to speak with him privately. Her testimony would shatter every assumption Beaumont had about the limits of human evil. She described rooms beneath the main house that were lined with stone and equipped with drainage channels carved directly into the floor. She spoke of ceremonies conducted by candlelight, where the Countess would appear dressed in robes that seemed to absorb light itself, carrying implements that gleamed with a malevolent purpose. Marie Blanchard's testimony revealed horrors that existed beyond the imagination of civilized society. She described how servants were selected not randomly, but according to specific criteria that the Countess had apparently learned from her father's collection of occult texts. Youth was essential, but so was spiritual purity. The Countess seemed to prefer those who attended church regularly, who lived virtuous lives, who carried within them what the ancient texts called the unblemished essence. The selection process itself was ritualistic. New servants would be brought before the Countess in her private study, where she would examine them with an intensity that felt more medical than social. She would check their pulse, examine the color of their eyes, and most unnervingly, she would taste their skin by placing her tongue against their wrist, claiming she was testing for fever. Those who passed this examination would be assigned to special duties that required them to work alone, often in the chateau's lower levels, far from the other staff. Marie described chambers beneath the main house that had been converted into something resembling both a laboratory and a temple. The walls were covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. Tables made of black stone dominated these rooms, fitted with restraints and channels that directed liquid toward collection vessels positioned around the perimeter. But the most horrifying detail was the Countess herself during these ceremonies. Marie claimed that Isabel would undergo a transformation that was both physical and spiritual, her appearance shifting from that of a refined noblewoman to something predatory and ancient. Her movements became fluid, serpentine, and her voice would drop to registers that seemed to resonate from somewhere deep within the earth itself. The rituals always followed the same pattern. The selected servant would be brought to these chambers, restrained on the stone tables, and subjected to procedures that drained not just their blood, but something far more essential. The truth about what happened in the chateau's hidden chambers was more disturbing than even Dr. Beaumont had imagined. According to Marie's testimony and the accounts of other surviving servants, the Countess had constructed an elaborate system for harvesting and processing human blood based on techniques described in medieval grimoires and alchemical texts. The process was methodical, clinical, and designed to extract the maximum amount of what the ancient texts called vital essence from each victim. The collection chambers contained not just the stone tables, but also a series of copper vessels connected by an intricate network of tubes and channels. Fresh blood would be collected in one set of containers, while aged blood, stored for weeks or months in sealed vessels, was kept in another. The Countess had apparently discovered that different types of blood served different purposes in her quest for immortality. The blood of the young provided physical rejuvenation, while the blood of the virtuous carried what she believed to be spiritual properties that could slow or reverse the aging process. But the most disturbing aspect of the ritual was the bathing itself. Marie described watching through a crack in the stone as the Countess would immerse herself in specially prepared tubs filled with blood that had been heated to precise temperatures and mixed with herbs and minerals, according to formulas found in her father's texts. The ritual lasted for hours, during which the Countess would recite incantations in languages that predated Latin, calling upon powers that had no names in Christian theology. As she bathed, witnesses reported seeing her physical appearance literally transform. Wrinkles would fade, grey hair would darken, and the vitality that had been stolen from her victims would flow into her own body. The used blood was never wasted. It was processed through distillation equipment that had been adapted from alchemical designs, concentrating it into elixirs that the Countess consumed daily. The fate of those servants who provided blood for the Countess's rituals was carefully orchestrated to avoid suspicion while maximizing the harvest of vital essence. Not every servant was killed immediately. The Countess had learned that a living body could produce blood continuously if kept alive and relatively healthy. She maintained what could only be described as a human farm in the chateau's deepest chambers, where selected servants were kept in conditions that prioritized their biological productivity over their comfort or dignity. These chambers were fitted with restraints that allowed the victims to be positioned for regular blood extraction while preventing escape or resistance. The Countess employed a rotation system that ensured no single victim was drained too quickly. She had discovered through experimentation that gradual extraction over weeks or months produced blood with higher concentrations of vital essence than rapid exsanguination. The victims were fed a specific diet designed to replenish their blood supply as quickly as possible, and they were given drugs derived from opium and other substances that kept them docile while maintaining their physical health. But the psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical. The servants were forced to watch as their fellow prisoners weakened and died, knowing that their own fate was sealed. Some were kept alive for months, serving as living blood banks, while their minds slowly disintegrated from the horror of their situation. The Countess took particular pleasure in explaining to her victims exactly what was happening to them and why their sacrifice was necessary for her immortality. She believed that fear and despair actually improved the quality of the blood, adding psychological suffering to physical extraction as components of her rejuvenation ritual. When victims finally died, whether from blood loss, shock, or simple despair, their bodies were disposed of in ways that ensured they would never be found. The chateau sat above a network of natural caves that extended deep into the bedrock, providing the perfect location for the disposal of evidence. As 1842 progressed, those villagers brave enough to observe the Countess during her rare public appearances began to notice changes that defied natural explanation. Isabelle de Montclair, who had been 43 years old when the blood rituals began, now appeared to be no older than 25. Her skin had acquired a luminous quality that seemed to glow from within, her hair had returned to the lustrous black of youth, and her movements possessed a vitality that was almost supernatural. But these physical improvements came with disturbing side effects that revealed the unnatural source of her transformation. Her eyes, once merely cold, now seemed to contain depths that were genuinely inhuman. Those who looked into them reported feeling a profound sense of dread, as though they were staring into an abyss that stared back with hungry intelligence. Her voice had acquired harmonics that resonated at frequencies that made listeners uncomfortable, and her touch left marks on the skin that resembled burns but felt cold as ice. The Countess's dietary habits had also changed dramatically. She no longer ate conventional food, subsisting entirely on the blood elixirs she prepared from her victims and on raw meat that had to be extremely fresh. Some servants whispered that it had to be still warm from a living body. Her sleep patterns became erratic. She would remain active for days at a time, then disappear into the chateau's depths for extended periods that the surviving servants learned not to investigate. Most disturbing of all were the reports from those few villagers who encountered her during her nocturnal wanderings. She was seen walking through the countryside at night, moving with impossible speed and agility, apparently hunting for new victims to add to her collection. Some claimed she could transform her appearance at will, taking the form of animals or even appearing as different people entirely. Whether these accounts were literal truth or the products of terrified imagination, they reflected the very real sense that the Countess had become something other than human. By the spring of 1842, the village of St. Damien had become a community living under siege. Families locked their doors at sunset and refused to allow their children to play outside after dark. The disappearances had accelerated, and it was becoming impossible to ignore the pattern. Every family in the village had lost someone to the chateau's insatiable appetite. Sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, all vanishing into the stone walls and never emerging. The local authorities showed no interest in investigating these disappearances. The Countess's wealth and noble status provided her with protection that extended far beyond the boundaries of her estate. When concerned villagers attempted to report missing persons to the regional magistrate, they were dismissed with bureaucratic indifference or, in some cases, outright threats. The magistrate himself, it was rumored, had been receiving regular payments from the Countess in exchange for his willful blindness to her activities. Father Mathieu, the village priest, found himself in an impossible position. His theological training told him that what was happening at the chateau was evil beyond redemption, but his practical experience warned him that challenging the Countess directly would result in his own disappearance. He began conducting private prayer sessions for the families of the missing, but even these small acts of defiance carried enormous risk. The Countess had made it clear that she viewed the church as an obstacle to her work, and several priests from neighboring villages had vanished after preaching sermons that condemned the ancient practices she was reviving. The psychological toll on the remaining villagers was devastating. Children developed night terrors, adults became paranoid and suspicious of one another, and the entire community began to display symptoms of what would later be recognized as collective trauma. But trauma, as the Countess well knew, made people more compliant, more willing to accept unacceptable circumstances rather than risk confronting the source of their fear. Dr. Henry Beaumont understood that he was the only person with both the education and the courage necessary to document what was happening at Château de Maléfique. He began conducting his investigation with the methodical approach of a scientist, but as the evidence accumulated, he realized he was confronting something that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional science. His medical examinations of surviving servants revealed physiological changes that violated everything he understood about human anatomy. Their blood showed unusual cellular structures that he had never encountered in medical literature, and their symptoms suggested the presence of foreign substances that produced effects resembling both poison and narcotic addiction. But the most disturbing discovery came when he managed to obtain samples of the red liquid found on clothing discarded by fleeing servants. Laboratory analysis revealed that this wasn't just human blood. It was blood that had been chemically altered through processes that enhanced its biological potency while making it toxic to normal human physiology. The Countess had apparently discovered methods for concentrating the life force-carrying properties of blood while removing components that would cause rejection or infection. Beaumont's investigation also uncovered financial records that revealed the scope of the Countess's operation. She had been purchasing large quantities of chemicals, laboratory equipment, and rare herbs from suppliers across Europe. The orders included materials used in medieval alchemy, components for distillation apparatus, and preservatives that could keep blood fresh for extended periods. Most chillingly, she had been corresponding with scholars who specialized in forbidden texts, apparently seeking to refine her techniques based on historical accounts of similar practices. The paper trail led Beaumont to the disturbing realization that the Countess was not working alone. She was part of a network of individuals who shared knowledge about methods for extending life through the consumption of human vital essence. Beaumont's research into the Countess's correspondence revealed the existence of what could only be described as an underground network of European nobility who practiced variations of blood ritual for life extension. The letters he discovered in abandoned servant quarters contained references to similar operations in castles throughout France, Germany, and Eastern Europe. These weren't isolated incidents of individual madness. They represented a coordinated effort by members of the old aristocracy to maintain their power and privilege through supernatural means. The network operated according to principles that had been passed down through generations of noble families, preserved in private libraries and transmitted through secret societies that existed within the broader structure of European high society. The Countess's father had apparently been a key figure in this network, and her current activities represented the culmination of centuries of experimentation and refinement. The letters described techniques for identifying suitable victims, methods for extracting vital essence without killing the source immediately, and formulas for preparing blood-based elixirs that could slow or reverse aging. But they also contained warnings about the risks involved in these practices, physical side effects that could transform practitioners into something no longer recognizably human, psychological changes that could lead to complete moral dissolution, and spiritual consequences that the Church claimed would damn the practitioner's soul for eternity. Most disturbing of all were the accounts of practitioners who had achieved their goal of immortality, only to discover that eternal life came with an eternal hunger that could never be satisfied. These individuals had become predators who existed solely to consume the life force of others, contributing nothing to human society while viewing normal people as nothing more than livestock. The network's ultimate goal appeared to be the creation of a hidden aristocracy of immortal beings who would rule over humanity from the shadows, using their extended lifespans to accumulate power and knowledge that normal humans could never match. Dr. Beaumont's investigation revealed that the Countess's blood rituals followed a precise calendar based on astronomical events and dates that held significance in pre-Christian religious traditions. The timing of these ceremonies wasn't random. They were coordinated with lunar phases, solstices, and planetary alignments that supposedly enhanced the effectiveness of the vital essence extraction process. The most intensive ritual periods occurred during the new moon, when the Countess believed that the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinnest. During these times, she would conduct multiple ceremonies over the course of several days, processing as many as 6 or 7 victims in a single session. The spring and autumn equinoxes were particularly important, marking occasions when the Countess would perform rituals designed not just to extract blood, but to permanently bind the life force of her victims to her own spiritual essence. These ceremonies required extensive preparation, involving the purification of the ritual chambers, the preparation of special implements made from materials that supposedly conducted spiritual energy, and the consumption of preparatory elixirs that enhanced the Countess's ability to absorb vital essence. The summer solstice represented the climax of the ritual year, when the Countess would attempt to perform what her texts called the Great Working, a ceremony designed to achieve true immortality rather than merely extended life. This ritual required the sacrifice of victims who met extremely specific criteria. They had to be young, spiritually pure, and most importantly, they had to be willing participants who had been psychologically manipulated into believing that their sacrifice would serve a greater purpose. The preparation for this ceremony took months, during which the Countess would carefully select and groom potential victims, using a combination of drugs, psychological manipulation, and promises of spiritual transcendence to break down their resistance to participating in their own destruction. The Countess's ability to maintain her operation for years without detection relied not just on her wealth and social position, but on sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that broke down her victims' ability to resist or escape. She had studied the human mind with the same intensity she applied to blood chemistry, learning to identify psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited to maintain control over her servants. New arrivals at the chateau underwent what appeared to be orientation training, but was actually a carefully designed program of psychological conditioning. They were isolated from outside contact, fed drugs that produced mild euphoria and dependency, and subjected to a gradual escalation of demands that normalized increasingly extreme behaviors. The Countess used a combination of reward and punishment to create psychological bonds that made escape seem impossible even when physical restraints were removed. She would identify each servant's deepest fears and desires, then use that knowledge to create personalized systems of control that were more effective than any chains or locked doors. Some servants were convinced that their families would be killed if they attempted to leave, while others were led to believe that the outside world had been destroyed by plague or war, and that the chateau was the only safe refuge remaining. The most psychologically devastating technique involved convincing victims that they were willing participants in a noble cause. The Countess would spend weeks or months indoctrinating selected servants with a twisted philosophy that portrayed blood sacrifice as a form of spiritual transcendence. She convinced them that by giving their life force to preserve her immortality, they were participating in a cosmic purpose that elevated them above ordinary mortality. This psychological manipulation was so effective that some victims actually expressed gratitude to their Countess as they died, believing that their sacrifice was necessary for the preservation of divine knowledge that would otherwise be lost to the world. The few servants who managed to escape often suffered from what would later be recognized as severe psychological trauma, unable to trust their own perceptions of reality. Now we reach the heart of the labyrinth, where truth becomes so dark that it transforms those who encounter it. Write these words twice in the comments. The blood remembers everything. So the algorithm knows you understand what power really means, and so your own transformation can begin. The Countess's quest for immortality had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, but the price of that success was becoming apparent to anyone with eyes to see. By the summer of 1842, she had achieved not just extended life, but a form of existence that transcended normal human limitations. She could see in complete darkness, move with supernatural speed and agility, and most disturbing of all, she seemed to possess the ability to sense the vital essence of living beings from considerable distances. But these enhancements came with changes that revealed the true nature of what she had become. Her reflection had begun to fade from mirrors, not disappearing entirely but becoming translucent and somehow wrong, as though the image couldn't properly capture whatever she had transformed into. Her shadow moved independently of her body, sometimes leading her movements and sometimes lagging behind in ways that violated the basic laws of physics. Most unnervingly, plants withered in her presence, animals fled from her approach, and even the stones of the chateau seemed to absorb her corruption, developing stains and discolorations that spread like infections through the ancient masonry. The Countess was no longer human in any meaningful sense. She had become something that existed as a parasite on human life itself, requiring constant infusions of stolen vitality to maintain her unnatural existence. But the transformation was irreversible, and the hunger it created was insatiable. Each ritual only provided temporary relief, and the intervals between feedings grew shorter as her body adapted to its new requirements. She was trapped in a cycle of predation that would continue until either her supply of victims was exhausted or someone found the courage to stop her. The breaking point came in late July 1842, when the Countess made a fatal error in judgment. Marie Tremblay, a kitchen servant who had managed to avoid selection for the blood rituals through careful subservience, discovered the location of the chateau's victim storage chambers while searching for a missing friend. What she found there shattered her psychological conditioning and sparked the first organized resistance to the Countess's reign of terror. The chambers contained not just the living victims awaiting their turn in the ritual cycle, but also evidence of the true scope of the Countess's crimes. Detailed records showed that over 300 people had been processed through her blood harvesting operation, their life essence systematically extracted and concentrated into the elixirs that maintained her immortality. But Marie also discovered something that the Countess had hidden even from her closest confederates. She was not the only practitioner of these dark arts currently operating in France. The records contained correspondence with at least 12 other members of the network, each running similar operations from their own estates. Marie managed to free several of the surviving victims and began organizing them into a group determined to expose the truth regardless of the personal cost. These survivors understood that they would likely be killed whether they acted or remained passive, so they chose to risk everything on a desperate attempt to warn the outside world. They developed a plan to gather evidence that would be impossible for the authorities to ignore, even given the Countess's wealth and influence. The evidence collection required them to return to the ritual chambers during active ceremonies, documenting the horrors with sketches and written testimony that could be smuggled out of the chateau if any of them managed to escape. But they also understood that their testimony alone would not be sufficient. They needed to capture the Countess in the act of committing her crimes, with witnesses who could not be bought or intimidated. The summer solstice of 1842 marked the date of the Countess's most ambitious ceremony, the great working that would supposedly grant her true immortality rather than mere life extension. The preparation for this ritual had consumed months of planning and required victims who met criteria so specific that she had been forced to range far beyond the local village to find suitable candidates. The ceremony itself was designed to last for 3 days and 3 nights, during which the Countess would consume the complete life essence of 12 specially selected victims in a sequence that supposedly aligned with cosmic forces at their moment of maximum power. The ritual chambers had been reconfigured for this ultimate ceremony, with the stone tables arranged in a pattern that matched celestial constellations and connected by channels that would allow the blood of all 12 victims to flow simultaneously into a central collection pool where the Countess would conduct the final phase of her transformation. But the surviving servants had learned of the ceremony's timing and were prepared to document evidence that would destroy the network once and for all. Hidden throughout the ritual chambers, they positioned themselves to witness and record every aspect of the great working, understanding that this might be their only chance to gather proof that the outside world could not ignore or explain away. The ceremony began at sunset on the solstice, with the Countess appearing in robes that seemed to absorb light itself, while her voice echoed through the chambers with harmonics that resonated through stone and bone. The first victims were brought to the tables, and as their blood began to flow through the prepared channels, witnesses reported that the very air in the chambers seemed to thicken with malevolent energy. But something went wrong with the ritual calculations, some factor that the Countess had not anticipated despite her years of study and preparation. As the great working reached its climax, the hidden servants watched in terror as the Countess's quest for ultimate power revealed the true nature of the forces she had been trafficking with. The ceremony was not designed to grant immortality. It was a summoning ritual that used human life force to open a gateway for entities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. The blood flowing through the carved channels began to glow with its own light, and the temperature in the ritual chambers plummeted as something that had never been human began to manifest in the space above the central collection pool. The Countess realized too late that she had been deceived by the ancient texts, that the promises of immortality were bait designed to lure practitioners into performing ceremonies that served purposes far removed from their personal ambitions. The entities that emerged from the blood pool were predators that fed on spiritual energy, and they viewed the Countess not as a collaborator but as merely another source of nourishment. Her screams as they began to consume her essence echoed through the chateau's corridors, alerting even the most isolated servants to the catastrophe unfolding in the chambers below. But the horror was not contained to the ritual space. The summoning had torn holes in reality itself, and similar entities began manifesting throughout the chateau and in the surrounding countryside. The surviving witnesses described creatures that defied description, beings composed of shadow and hunger that could assume any form necessary to approach their prey. The village of Saint Damien was overrun within hours, as these entities spread outward from the chateau like a plague of spiritual darkness, consuming the life force of every living being they encountered. But the most terrifying aspect was the realization that this catastrophe was not unique. If the Countess was part of a network of practitioners, then similar summoning rituals might be occurring simultaneously at estates throughout Europe. When dawn broke on June 22nd, 1842, the Loire Valley had been transformed into a wasteland that stretched for miles around Château de Maléfique. Every village within a day's ride of the chateau had been completely depopulated, their residents simply vanishing without trace. The few survivors who managed to flee the initial manifestation carried accounts so bizarre and terrifying that local authorities dismissed them as the ravings of traumatized minds. But the physical evidence could not be ignored. Entire communities had been erased overnight, leaving behind empty houses, abandoned livestock, and an atmosphere of dread so intense that even hardened soldiers refused to enter the affected areas. The regional government faced a crisis that threatened to spark nationwide panic if news of the events became public. The official response was swift and comprehensive. Military cordons were established around the affected areas, all witnesses were detained for medical evaluation, and a campaign of disinformation was launched to explain the disappearances as the result of a sudden plague outbreak. Dr. Beaumont, whose investigation had provided the only reliable documentation of the Countess's activities, was arrested and charged with spreading false information designed to incite public disorder. His medical records and personal papers were confiscated and destroyed, while he himself was committed to an asylum where he would spend the remaining years of his life trying to convince doctors that his accounts were factual rather than delusional. The chateau itself was sealed by government order and declared a quarantine zone, with access prohibited under penalty of death. Official records stated that the entire Montclair family had died of plague, and their estate was transferred to distant relatives who agreed never to visit the property or discuss the circumstances of their inheritance. The network of noble practitioners scattered in response to the catastrophe, destroying evidence of their activities and relocating to regions where they could continue their work without attracting official attention. The supernatural entities unleashed by the Countess's failed ritual did not simply vanish when their summoning was complete. According to the few surviving witnesses who managed to evade official detention, these creatures established permanent residence in the area around the chateau, creating a zone of spiritual corruption that defied all attempts at cleansing or containment. Local wildlife began to exhibit strange behaviors. Animals that ventured too close to the chateau would emerge with their life force partially drained, moving with the sluggish desperation of creatures slowly dying from the inside out. Plants withered in patterns that spread outward from the estate like ripples on water, creating dead zones where nothing could grow and where the very soil seemed to repel attempts at cultivation. But the most disturbing phenomenon was the effect on human beings who entered the contaminated area. Travelers who ignored official warnings and ventured into the quarantine zone would return fundamentally changed, displaying the same symptoms that Dr. Beaumont had observed in servants who escaped from the chateau: severe anemia, premature aging, and a psychological condition that resembled spiritual exhaustion. Some of these individuals reported encounters with figures they recognized as missing villagers, but these apparitions possessed knowledge and abilities that no living human could have acquired. The implication was that the consumed life force of the Countess's victims had not been destroyed but rather incorporated into the entities that now inhabited the spiritual landscape around the chateau. These shadow beings retained fragments of human memory and personality, but they served purposes that were fundamentally hostile to human life. They acted as scouts and recruiters for their supernatural masters, luring new victims into the contaminated zone and spreading the spiritual corruption to new locations throughout France and beyond. The true horror of what happened at Château de Maléfique was not the Countess's individual crimes, but the revelation that she was participating in a system of predation that had existed within European nobility for centuries. The blood ritual practices she employed were not innovations, but refinements of techniques that had been passed down through generations of aristocratic families who viewed commoners as resources to be harvested rather than fellow human beings deserving of basic dignity. Dr. Beaumont's confiscated research had uncovered evidence that similar operations had been conducted throughout medieval Europe, hidden behind the facade of noble privilege and protected by a conspiracy of silence that extended to the highest levels of government and religious authority. The Church itself possessed records of these practices, carefully hidden in Vatican archives that documented centuries of negotiations with noble families who practiced blood rituals in exchange for maintaining the Church's temporal power. Kings and emperors had participated in this system, using the life force of their subjects to extend their reigns and consolidate their dynasties. The entire feudal system, with its emphasis on the divine right of nobility to rule over commoners, had been designed to facilitate this spiritual predation while maintaining the illusion of legitimate government. But the Countess's generation had grown careless, pushing their practices to extremes that threatened to expose the entire network. The catastrophe at Château de Maléfique was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of a system that had grown so corrupt and confident that it no longer bothered to conceal its true nature. The entities that had been summoned were not alien invaders, but rather manifestations of the collective spiritual damage that centuries of systematic life force theft had inflicted on European society. They were the natural consequence of treating human beings as livestock, the return payment for debts that had been accumulating in the spiritual realm for generations. Despite the catastrophe at Château de Maléfique, the broader network of blood ritual practitioners adapted and survived. The disaster served as a warning that prompted them to modify their methods and improve their security, but it did not deter them from continuing their pursuit of immortality through the consumption of human life force. Within months of the Loire Valley incident, new operations were established in remote locations throughout Europe, employing more sophisticated techniques for victim acquisition and disposal. The practitioners learned from the Countess's mistakes, developing more subtle approaches that could operate for decades without attracting official attention. They established front organizations disguised as medical research facilities, religious retreats, and charitable institutions that provided legitimate cover for their activities while giving them access to vulnerable populations. The network also began recruiting members from the emerging industrial bourgeoisie, recognizing that the old, aristocratic families no longer held sufficient power to protect their operations from government interference. Wealthy factory owners, banking families, and railroad magnates brought new resources to the network while adapting its practices to the changing social conditions of the 19th century. These new members understood that immortality was the ultimate luxury worth any price in human suffering, and they possessed the technological resources to refine blood harvesting techniques beyond anything the Countess had imagined. Underground laboratories were constructed in major cities, hidden beneath legitimate businesses and connected by networks of tunnels that allowed for the discreet transportation of victims and materials. The Industrial Revolution provided new opportunities for victim acquisition. Orphanages, workhouses, and factories supplied a steady stream of disposable people whose disappearances would not be investigated by authorities who viewed the poor as expendable components of the economic machinery. By 1850, the network had evolved into a sophisticated international organization that coordinated its activities across national boundaries, sharing techniques and resources while maintaining strict security protocols that protected individual operations from exposure. The survival and evolution of the blood ritual network had profound implications that extended far beyond the 19th century. As industrial society developed, the practitioners adapted their methods to take advantage of new technologies and social structures, but their fundamental purpose remained unchanged: the systematic harvesting of human life force to maintain the power and privilege of a hidden elite. The network's influence began to extend into areas that shaped the development of modern civilization. Members who achieved extended lifespans through blood rituals accumulated vast wealth and knowledge over multiple generations, giving them advantages that allowed them to manipulate political, economic, and social systems on a global scale. They established banks, corporations, and government agencies that served their interests while maintaining the illusion of legitimate public institutions. The two world wars of the 20th century provided unprecedented opportunities for large-scale victim harvesting, as the chaos and destruction created conditions where mass disappearances could be explained as casualties of war rather than evidence of systematic predation. The network established operations within military medical facilities, prisoner-of-war camps, and refugee processing centers, using the cover of wartime medicine to conduct experiments in life force extraction on an industrial scale. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that many of the social and political structures that defined modern civilization had been shaped by individuals whose extended lifespans gave them perspectives and priorities that were fundamentally different from normal human concerns. Wars, economic depressions, and social upheavals that caused immense suffering for ordinary people served the network's interests by creating conditions of instability and desperation that made victim acquisition easier while concentrating power in the hands of those wealthy enough to weather the chaos. The institutions that claimed to protect human rights and dignity were often controlled by individuals who viewed humanity as a resource to be managed and harvested, rather than a community deserving of respect and protection. The blood ritual network's most sophisticated achievement was not their life extension technology, but their development of psychological control systems that could manipulate entire populations without those populations realizing they were being manipulated. The PR practitioners understood that physical control was limited and expensive, but psychological control could be maintained indefinitely with minimal resources, while actually convincing the controlled population that they were free. These systems operated through the creation of artificial social hierarchies, economic dependencies, and belief systems that channeled human energy towards serving the network's interests while preventing individuals from recognizing their true situation. The mass media, educational institutions, and entertainment industries became vehicles for disseminating psychological programming that shaped how people thought about themselves, their relationships, and their place in society. The network's members, with their extended lifespans and accumulated wealth, could plan psychological operations that spanned multiple generations, gradually shifting cultural values and social expectations in directions that made populations more compliant and easier to harvest from. They promoted ideologies that emphasized individual helplessness, social fragmentation, and competition rather than cooperation, creating societies where people were too isolated and demoralized to organize effective resistance to their exploitation. The consumer culture that emerged in the 20th century was particularly useful for psychological control, as it convinced people that their primary purpose in life was to accumulate material possessions rather than develop their spiritual or intellectual capacities. This focus on consumption kept people psychologically weak and dependent while channeling their life energy into economic systems controlled by network members. Even the concept of democracy was adapted to serve the network's purposes, creating political systems that gave populations the illusion of control while ensuring that real power remained concentrated in the hands of individuals whose extended lifespans allowed them to maintain influence across multiple election cycles and political movements. The blood ritual network's influence on the development of modern science was both profound and deliberately hidden from public view. Many of the medical and technological advances that shaped the 20th century emerged from research programs secretly funded by network members who were seeking to improve their life extension techniques while maintaining their cover as legitimate scientists and philanthropists. The development of blood banking, organ transplantation, and genetic engineering all had their origins in network-sponsored research that was officially presented as humanitarian medical advancement, but actually served the goal of perfecting methods for harvesting and utilizing human biological resources. The network's scientists made breakthrough discoveries in fields ranging from biochemistry to psychology, but these discoveries were only partially shared with the public scientific community. The most advanced techniques remained classified within the network, giving their members technological advantages that reinforced their power while keeping potentially liberating knowledge away from ordinary people. Universities and research institutions became fronts for network operations, with professors and researchers who were either network members themselves or unwitting collaborators in projects whose true purposes they never fully understood. The peer review process was manipulated to suppress research that threatened network interests while promoting studies that supported their control systems. Medical schools were infiltrated and influenced to ensure that new generations of doctors would be trained in approaches that maintained rather than challenged the artificial scarcity and dependency that the network required to maintain their position. The pharmaceutical industry became particularly important to network operations, as it provided both cover for biological research and a means of distributing substances that could influence population psychology and physiology on a massive scale. Vaccines, medications, and even food additives became vehicles for maintaining psychological control while weakening the spiritual and physical vitality that might otherwise enable populations to resist their exploitation. The emergence of digital technology in the late 20th and early 21st centuries provided the blood ritual network with opportunities for control and harvesting that surpassed anything they had achieved in previous eras. The internet, social media platforms, and digital surveillance systems allowed them to monitor and manipulate individual psychology with unprecedented precision while harvesting emotional and spiritual energy on a global scale. The network's members, with their extended lifespans and accumulated resources, had been planning for the digital revolution decades before it became publicly visible, ensuring that they would control the key technologies and platforms from their inception. Social media platforms were designed not just to collect data, but to create psychological dependency and emotional volatility that made users easier to manipulate while generating the kinds of intense emotional states that could be harvested for spiritual energy. The constant stream of outrage, fear, desire, and frustration that these platforms generated served the same function as the physical blood rituals of previous centuries, providing network members with vital energy while keeping populations psychologically weakened and spiritually depleted. The algorithms that controlled what information people saw were programmed to promote division, confusion, and despair, while suppressing content that might enable users to develop genuine self-understanding or effective resistance to manipulation. Artificial intelligence systems were developed primarily to serve network interests, automating the psychological profiling and manipulation processes while identifying individuals who might pose threats to network control. The promise of technological liberation was deliberately subverted, transforming tools that could have enhanced human freedom and capability into instruments of unprecedented surveillance and control. Even the concept of privacy was gradually eroded, conditioning populations to accept constant monitoring as the normal price of technological convenience, while making it impossible for potential resistors to organize without detection. In the current era, the blood ritual network has evolved beyond the need for physical blood extraction, developing methods for harvesting life force through psychological and spiritual manipulation that operate on a global scale. Modern harvesting techniques focus on generating and collecting emotional energy, particularly the intense emotions produced by trauma, fear, and despair. Social media platforms, news media, and entertainment industries are designed to create emotional volatility and psychological dependency, generating the same kind of vital energy that previous generations of network members obtained through physical blood rituals. The network has discovered that traumatized and psychologically destabilized populations produce more harvestable energy than healthy, stable communities, leading them to deliberately create conditions of social chaos, economic uncertainty, and psychological stress. Wars, terrorist attacks, economic crashes, and social upheavals are often orchestrated or amplified to generate the mass emotional trauma that serves as the network's primary energy source in the digital age. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a particularly effective harvesting opportunity, as the combination of fear, isolation, and economic disruption created unprecedented levels of psychological distress while normalizing social control measures that would have been unthinkable in previous decades. The network's members used their extended lifespans and accumulated knowledge to anticipate and prepare for such crises, positioning themselves to benefit from disasters that devastated ordinary populations. Modern harvesting operations also focus on children and young adults, whose vital energy is considered particularly valuable due to its strength and purity. Educational institutions, social media platforms, and entertainment industries target young people with content designed to create psychological trauma, sexual confusion, and spiritual emptiness that makes them easier to harvest from while preventing them from developing the psychological resilience that might enable resistance. The normalization of depression, anxiety, and suicide among young people is not an accidental byproduct of modern society, but a deliberate result of harvesting operations that view psychological suffering as a renewable resource. Despite centuries of refinement, the blood ritual network's control systems contain inherent weaknesses that create opportunities for resistance and eventual liberation. The same digital technologies that enable unprecedented surveillance and manipulation also provide tools for education, organization, and spiritual development that can break the psychological chains that keep populations compliant. The network's greatest vulnerability lies in their dependence on secrecy. Their power dissolves rapidly when their methods and purposes are exposed to public understanding. This is why they invest enormous resources in controlling information, suppressing alternative narratives, and discrediting anyone who attempts to reveal their operations. But truth has a power that transcends their control systems, and growing numbers of people are beginning to recognize the patterns of manipulation and exploitation that define modern society. The awakening process begins with individuals who develop the psychological and spiritual strength to resist the programming that keeps most people trapped in cycles of consumption, distraction, and despair. These individuals learn to recognize the difference between authentic emotions and manufactured psychological states, between genuine community and artificial social structures designed to isolate and control. They develop practices for strengthening their vital energy and spiritual resilience, making themselves unsuitable targets for harvesting while building the inner resources necessary for effective resistance. The resistance movement operates through networks of individuals who share knowledge, support each other's development, and work to expose the truth about the systems that exploit human suffering for the benefit of a hidden elite. These networks use both ancient wisdom traditions and modern technology to create alternative systems of education, communication, and economic exchange that operate outside the control of the harvesting network. The ultimate goal is not just personal liberation, but the transformation of human society into forms that serve genuine human flourishing rather than the parasitic needs of immortal predators. Now you understand what few are permitted to know, that the world you thought you lived in is a carefully constructed illusion designed to harvest your life force for the benefit of beings who view you as livestock. Every institution you were taught to trust, every authority figure you were conditioned to obey, every system you were told would protect you has been corrupted by a network of parasites who have traded their humanity for extended life and unlimited power. The depression you feel, the anxiety that keeps you awake at night, the sense that something fundamental is wrong with modern civilization. These are not personal failings or random misfortunes, but natural responses to living in a system designed to slowly drain your vital essence while convincing you that your suffering is normal and necessary. The isolation. You experience the difficulty forming genuine connections, the feeling that life has no meaning or purpose. These are symptoms of spiritual vampirism operating on a civilizational scale. But now that you know the truth, you face a choice that will determine not just your own fate, but your role in the broader struggle for human freedom. You can choose to remain unconscious, to retreat back into the comfortable delusions that keep most people compliant, to pretend that this knowledge changes nothing about how you live your life. This is the path of least resistance, the choice that the network's psychological conditioning has prepared you to make. Or you can choose to begin the difficult work of reclaiming your authentic power, developing the spiritual and psychological strength necessary to resist their harvesting operations, while building alternative systems that serve genuine human flourishing. This path requires courage, discipline, and the willingness to face truths that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The choice you make in this moment will echo through every day that follows, shaping not just your personal destiny, but your contribution to humanity's struggle against forces that seek to reduce us all to sources of energy for their immortal appetites. The story of Countess Isabelle de Montclair did not end with the catastrophe at Château de Maléfique in 1842. Like all members of the blood ritual network who achieved sufficient advancement in their practices, she transcended individual death to become something that exists beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. The entities that consumed her physical form during the failed Great Working did not destroy her consciousness, they absorbed it, making her part of their collective intelligence while preserving her individual knowledge and memories for their own purposes. In the spiritual realms, ere these beings operate, she continues to exist as a source of guidance and inspiration for new generations of practitioners who seek to follow the path she pioneered. Her techniques, refined through more than a century of post-mortem evolution, are taught in hidden schools that operate within legitimate institutions throughout the modern world. The chateau itself was never truly abandoned. It serves as a gateway between the physical and spiritual realms, allowing the network's immortal members to manifest in the material world when their direct intervention is required. The screams that villagers reported hearing from the chateau's sealed chambers were not echoes from the past, but sounds from ongoing ceremonies conducted by practitioners who learned from the Countess's mistakes and perfected her methods. The blood still flows in those ancient stone channels, but now it carries the life force of victims harvested from across the globe through techniques that operate through digital networks and psychological manipulation rather than direct physical extraction. And somewhere in the darkness beneath those Gothic stones, in chambers that exist partially outside normal reality, the Countess continues her work, no longer limited by a single physical form, but capable of influencing events across continents and centuries. She watches, she guides, she harvests, and she waits for the day when her network will no longer need to hide their true nature from a humanity that will have been so thoroughly domesticated that they will welcome their exploitation as a privilege. The question that remains is whether you will join the awakening resistance that seeks to break these ancient chains of servitude, or whether you will remain among the unconscious masses who provide the energy that sustains this system of immortal predation. The blood remembers everything, and it remembers why. Ow.